Now we're going to get our hoop ready to stitch. The first thing that you're going to need is a 12-inch square of your background fabric, this white dots in our case, and a 12-inch square of your felt if you choose to back with it, which in this project I am because of the white. Then we're going to transfer our pattern onto our fabric. So if you're going to do it with a light box or a light source like a window, you're going to want to center your fabric on the pattern generally. It doesn't have to be specifically directly in the center, but you're going to want to make sure that you have enough room on the edges to tighten your fabric inside the hoop. And you'll straighten it up and exactly center it up once it's in the hoop, but for right now you want it to be just generally in the center. You'll trace over with whatever marking pen of your choice is if you're doing this method, or if you decide that you want to try this water-soluble interfacing, you will print it off, and then you'll bring it over to your fabric, and this has a protective backing on it, so you'll peel that away, and this side of it is sticky and tacky, and it's pressure sensitive, so once you pull off the backing, then again, this is where you'll just kind of generally center it. It doesn't have to be exactly in the center, but you'll want to push it down. And then what I like to do in order to make sure that there's a lot of contact between my pattern and my fabric is I'll get a brayer, just something flat and hard. You can use a credit card, whatever you have handy that you can just kind of brush along. And you want to do it a little bit gently so that you're not distorting your pattern or shifting things around, but enough pressure that you are getting that pattern to stick really well. And this is a good time to comment that after you've cut your fabric out, before you transfer your pattern on, you want to make sure that your fabric is nice and flat. If you have any creases from when you purchased your fabric or whatever, you'll want to make sure that you've pressed all of those out and your fabric is ready to be stitched on, because you're not going to want to put a lot of pressure on it after your stitches are on it. You don't want to flatten it down, so make sure it's nice and smooth before you get going. So once your pattern is transferred onto your fabric, you're going to place it on top of your felt, and then you're going to bring in your hoop. Now we're going to want to make sure that this tightening pin on your hoop is really loose. The felt adds a lot of bulk to your hoop, and so you want to make sure that you give it enough give that it can get over it. Now depending on what method you used to transfer your pattern, you need to be really careful about how you center your pattern at this point, or it doesn't matter, just generally centered. If you're doing something that requires water to disappear, like in this case, I will have to remove my stitching totally out of the hoop, stick it in water to dissolve the pattern, and then once it's dry, I'll put it back in my hoop if that's how I'm going to finish it. It doesn't matter if it's exactly centered. But if you're using either just the mechanical pencil or even the friction pens, you can leave it in your hoop once it's done. And the less you manhandle your stitching, the better, because it tends to stretch and distort. So you want to make sure that you're doing as little to it as you can. So if you're going to do something where you can leave it in the hoop and you're going to leave it in the hoop, take the time right now to make sure it's centered. And I'll show you a little bit how I like to do that. I will take my hands and just push down on the edges, on the tops and the bottoms of my hoop to see if I have it generally centered. And if I'm pretty happy with it, then I'll bring my outside hoop, and I like to catch the bottom and then bring it over. And again, with the felt, if you find that it's still sticking, you may need to loosen it even a little bit more, not so much that it pops out like I just did. And if that happens, this is just a little screw, and it's a threaded piece on this end, so you'll want it to just catch a couple of threads. And this one you might have to use a little bit of energy. Again, if you are leaving your project in the hoop, you want to pay attention to where this pin is. If you're planning on hanging it from that pin, which I do quite a bit, you'll want to make sure that it's centered right at the top of your hoop. So once you have it in there, you just keep pushing it down until all of the edges are gathered in the hoop. And sometimes you'll have to go around it, again, like I said, with this felt. Now you can see that there's still a little bit of pucker on my fabric once it's in there. And if that's the case, then you'll want to put one hand and hold your hoop in place, and then with the other hand, you just gently tug your fabric until it's smooth in the hoop and everything's flat. Now, the reason you want it flat and tight in your embroidery hoop is you want your stitches to lay flat on the fabric. If there's too much give in your fabric, but you're pulling your stitches tight, you're gonna end up with puckers on your background fabric, and it's not gonna lay nice and smooth when you're finished. So you'll wanna make sure that it's tight. Once it's on there, you may want to tighten this screw a little bit if you need to get it all the way tight, and then your hoop is ready to go. Now we'll get ready to get our thread.